So our next panel today is focused on research justice, shifting from extractive study to humanized relationship. Moderating the discussion today is Dr. Jay Pearson with Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. Dr. Pearson, thank you so much for being here today. Also with us, Aliyah Abdur Rahman, who's also one of the co-founders of Communities in Partnership, and she's the Director of Innovation for Liberation. Lorena Andrade, she is the Executive Director of La Mujer Obrera out of El Paso, Texas. And Dr. Danielle Spurlock with the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Please come to stage and welcome. Thank you.
And so once again, good morning. My name is Jay Pearson. I'm a professor at Duke Sanford School of Public Policy. And today I have the honor and indeed the privilege of moderating the panel discussion with the three experts that you see here on the stage. But before we get into that, I need to do two things. The first thing I would like to do is acknowledge how when I came in this morning and I heard Sister Vivette doing the introduction, acknowledging a part of my heritage that I have struggled to come to grips with over the life course. My father is from Halifax County, North Carolina, right? He grew up self-identified as Black Indian of the Haliwasaponi people, and I grew up in Hertford County, which is the home of the Meherrin people also. So thank you so very much for opening this, inviting in family and friends. And also, as I came in, I ran into three former students. I see other current students sitting in the audience. And for me, the real legacy of being an academician is not peer-reviewed publications and citation counts, but the degree to which we can meaningfully influence the educational process of this next generation of people and send them out into the world being grounded in fundamental truth, right? As hard as that might be for some of us to hear, that truth, that is, we gotta do that. Second thing, I've been sick the past couple of days. I'm slightly medicated this morning. And so my social filters might be reduced relative to what they otherwise might be. I shared that information with the folks here. They said that's a good thing because we want to have real conversation. That's our tone. So once again, I have the pleasure of moderating this panel discussion on justice for university research conducted in communities. But before we do that, I would like to give each of the three panelists an opportunity to take 3 minutes or so to talk a little bit about what brings them to this conversation and what they hope will happen in our time together today, after which I will attempt to set the tone for our discussion. And so first, Lorena Andrade, take a few minutes to tell us what you hope to do.
Good morning. My name is Lorena Andrade, and I'm with La Mujer Obrera, which means woman worker. We're a garment worker from El Paso, Texas, on the border with Mexico. We are women that lost our jobs due to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And we continue to struggle to say who defines who we are, right? In El Paso, we're an infinite source of cheap labor. That's the imposed identity. And we believe that our identity comes from our relationship with each other, with the earth, and that we have a right to protect that space in order to create that vision. And so, today I would hope to see and to hear from people about how that work can be supported, our right to this different ways of seeing, a willingness to acknowledge our different ways of seeing, and for us to have a right to put that into practice and to figure out what that is, because so much has been stolen from us that we don't always have the answers, but we know we have a right to figure it out, and we know we have a right to put it into practice.
Great, thank you, Lorena. Sister Aliyah Abdur Rahman.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all today. I'm so grateful to be in this space. Cameron has spoken about this group for so long, and so I'm excited to put some faces to names. We started talking about whose shoulders do we stand on, and it's Ramadan right now, so I would be remiss if I didn't speak about my background as a Black Muslim woman. For me, liberation from my family was really tied up in being able to see ourselves as Black people as something other than what this white supremacist system has told us who we are. And so my family comes from that tradition of claiming Islam as Black people, or reclaiming, as I'm learning now, some of the slaves who came over here, many of them were Muslim, reclaiming that as a way to self-determine and say who we are. And so my family migrated up to New York, and there did a lot of work in terms of social justice on the ground. My stepfather was the imam of Malcolm Shabazz, which is actually Malcolm X's mosque, when he became, I guess what we would call Orthodox Muslim. And so when I think about that work and how I grew up, it was always about knowing who your community is. It was always about, what does it mean to be Black in America? What does it mean to be free? How do we create our own systems? Food, press, land, where children, Black children, could grow up and experience freedom even within this sort of exterior of white supremacy. And so one of the things that was key for our community was education, right? And so we had our own schools and things like that, but many of the Islamic leaders set out with this idea that we would send some of our kids to these universities and institutions to be able to come back, get that knowledge and come back and utilize it for the freedom of Black people. And so I am a product of that experiment in many ways, and it's something very dear to me as I think about what is it meant to be a Black Muslim woman in America. What's that experience? What is my role? How am I always connected to my people? Because that's how I started. And so that's how I think about my work. I am a co-founder, along with many, many folks, of CIP. And all that means is we got together and said, we're going to do something for ourselves, right? We got together and said, like, we are going to not allow other folks to control us and write our narrative. And how are we going to lock arms together and decide, how can we be free now? And so that's what I'm obsessed about on a regular basis. You'll hear me talk a little bit more about this initiative that we started in CIP many, many years ago when it came to thinking about how do we develop our own solutions through innovation for liberation. But again, I'm so excited to be here today. And I'll pass it over to Dr. J again.
And last but certainly not least, Dr. Danielle Spurlock, who I recently learned might actually be kinfolk.
Yes. And I thank you and Vivette so much for opening up the space to talk about whose shoulders we stand on, because that's what keeps me going. I work in a white supremacist institution, as higher education is. And without that grounding, I would be lost and could have lost myself multiple times. I am descended from the Spurlocks of the Allegheny Mountains in Virginia. And from that, I really appreciate where my folk put their lives on the line as they founded an NAACP, when that danger, that willingness to do so that things can be better for us all. And the Eastern North Carolina connection, Northampton County, Potty Casey, North Carolina, and the Grant family, that was, one, how I experienced rural life, having grown up in Lexington, Kentucky, and Cincinnati, Ohio, but spending those summers with my grandparents. And more importantly, when I came back here for my first bout of graduate school, meeting Naima Muhammad and Gary Grant, which shifted that pathway that academia could have put me on, was very different because of my time with them, because they demanded a different relationship with research, with institutions, and is the relationship that we all deserve. One where we are in partnership, one where we believe the expertise of those who are most impacted, though where places like this are not the repository of knowledge and thus do not get to determine solutions. So it is on their shoulders that I stand, and I now have the great privilege of standing along those who founded and work with CIP, where they allowed me in to be a part of a conversation that they could have easily said no, and probably should have, given I'm still tied to an institution that looks to exploit. But they helped and gave the time to build the trust so we could do something different.
Great, thank you. My task now, if I understand it correctly, is to offer a conceptual definition of structural racism or structurally rooted systemic racism. And as we know the phenomenon in contemporary US society, it entails sets of social arrangements, conditions, interactions, and relationships that are systemically advantageous to majoritized population whites while being simultaneously systemically disadvantageous to Black, Indigenous, and additional other populations of color. This means that white American advantage comes at the cost of BIPOC disadvantage. There's a trade-off. So if some folks are getting something that they haven't earned, someone else produced it and they're taking it. Structural racism additionally holds that macro-level, big picture policy and other decision-making processes associated with racial construction, the fact that we have race in the first place, stratified racial hierarchies, the positions that different groups get relegated to, and racial bias, the mechanisms that relegate those populations to different positions, are central guiding features of the nation that were established before its formal founding, right? So this means that this is who we are, is who we've been since before the beginning, once again, of the nation. And quite frankly, unless something changes awfully quickly, and I don't see that happening, it's who we are likely to continue being for the foreseeable future, right? It also means that once these processes are set in motion, we don't require individual bad actors to keep this stuff going. It is essentially embedded, baked into those major institutions that comprise the broader social order, right? It pervades and suffuses virtually every domain of broader society and asserts and imposes influence at multiple levels within those domains. This also means that the impact of structurally rooted systemic racism is much greater than interpersonal discrimination, which unfortunately survey research continues to teach us is what most people think of when they hear the language of racism. I personally am not particularly affected if someone wants to say something to me or call me out of my name because I have the capacity to do the same. I am impacted when the institutions that I'm attempting to engage and negotiate do not reflect positively upon me and my people and my friends and loved ones, right? That's the distinction. Finally, structural racism then is defined as sets of social mechanisms operating from the macro level normative down through formal policy decision-making that influences the development and maintenance of racially biased institutions. This is the background and context that makes possible and supports those acts of interpersonal discrimination. In regular language, this means that one group of people, Northwestern European colonizers, imagined, brought into being, and advanced notions suggesting that they were inherently superior to the degree that they reserved the exclusive right to construct a society, including the institutions comprising it, and the rules and regulations that govern those institutions in ways that humanize them and essentially dehumanize everyone else. Preferred, unpreferred categories of people formally embedded in the rules and regulations, humanizing, dehumanizing, slavery, right? Appropriation of Native American historical lands were the motivations. These European colonizers argued that Blacks and Native peoples were inherently inferior to justify those two institutions, and despite the fact that they no longer formally legally exist, the inertia associated with their development continues even until today. And so none of us should be surprised when we see differences in major predictors, outcomes, and the relationships between them by racial category in the United States of America. These are the inevitable outcomes of a fundamentally unjust, dehumanizing social order, right? So our goal for today's panel is to examine a specific manifestation of these phenomena, namely how academic goals and standards guiding research in communities of color are misaligned with the goals, standards, and interests of the communities themselves. And to this end, we aspire to engage authentic conversation and dialogue in a real and unapologetic way. I opened by saying I was thankful for being here among family and friends, and my hope today is that I and the panelists here will have a family-type conversation, and sometimes that gets heated. And so if you're a distant relative, it's going to be all right. We're not going to do anything to you in this setting. So having said that, I will take my seat, switch to this other mic, and start with questioning. And so our very first question is, and this is for any of the panelists who feels comfortable responding, who is currently centered in research? And a second part, how does that play out in terms of rewarding and holding power? Oh, and also as the moderator, I reserve the right to respond to questions myself. But we family. Let's talk about it.
Right, I'm looking around. Everybody is looking.
Speak from the heart.
So who's centered in the research? I mean, I think we can all sit back and answer that question, and we know that it is not the communities that are harmed by this research. When I thought about, some of this stuff, Dr. Danielle always says her dad said people just got better at being racist, right? And my grandmother says the more things change, the more they stay the same. When I think about the impact of research on Black people, what I think about is who gets to collect the data, right? Who gets to collect the data? Who gets to spit it back out in ways in which we can't even understand what they collected? Who gets to make meaning of that data, right? For my life, for the lives of my family members, my community, and people that I love, right? And then not only that, after collecting all of this data, spitting it back out in ways that are not decipherable, then they go out and say, like, okay, this is what it means in terms of policy, right? This is what it means in terms of laws and regulations. This is what it means in terms of all of these ventures that pop up, both for-profit and nonprofit, that then go in our communities and make money off of us as they go out and continue to experiment on us. And I know many of you in here know what I mean by that, right? So what I think about when I think about research is clearly it's not for the people, right? That it is supposed to actually help. I think of it as another extension of a white supremacist system that was meant to lock out me and my people and continue to have us sort of running back and forth, trying to figure out how to survive, not even thrive.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think it's not just the conduct of the research, it's who has the power to define what is the problem. So I can even write the grant that someone can then go out and study. If I think that poverty at its core is because people don't work enough, I'm going to create a question and then I'm going to say, well, we need to get people to work. Rather than, is it because all these folks are working and you're not paying them a living wage? Is it because you ask too much and are an exploitive housing system? What are the reasons why we see pervasive poverty, and who benefits, who profits? That is a question, but that's not defined by who is actually having to live through that structural racism on a day-to-day basis, because we don't believe community members when they say things. It happened in our early work with CIP, which this wouldn't surprise anyone who knows Durham at this point. Old East, everyone who lives there is like, yeah, gentrification is occurring. Gentrification. Let me tell you all the ways it's occurring. We're hearing people say, using research, saying that but not as much as other places. We still have time. And yet they're saying, no, I already know people who've been displaced. I already know the number of permits. I can just count the portable toilets on the street and tell you that is a whole house renovation, and they're not going to do that renovation and then rent to somebody or sell it to someone who lives here currently. Why was that not acceptable data that we could act on? Instead, it has to be a problem determined by people who will say, but you don't understand housing.
That's right.
You don't understand how this works, even though you live it every day. We need to come and impose systems thinking. Academia loves systems thinking at this point. They really do. Every community I've ever worked with are better systems thinkers because they know all the systems, all the levers that are working either for or against them in their day-to-day lives as they try to negotiate to survive, let alone thrive. So why then does it need to be externally defined? And then it has to have that external definition to be valid enough to take action.
A follow-up, and I think this one should start with you, Danielle. As researchers, and maybe me, what are the reward structures? What sets of constraints and opportunities associated with those are we contending with or compelled to work under?
So my appointment is not contingent on the grants I bring in. I could not do the work I do if I were grant chasing. And that grant chasing sets up a system where I'm always looking for the next thing rather than actually doing the deep engagement in the relationships. If my reward structure is also about what I publish, some of which will be behind a paywall. Some of my own papers are behind paywalls that I can't get to at my university. So how can they actually have any impact to shift local policy? But that's also the structure that counts, the grants. How am I producing in that manner? And so many people told me that don't do this work now. Wait till after your tenure decision. I am a former college athlete. I believe you practice how you're going to play. And that delay in thinking that you're going to suddenly be a different person, a different engagement scholar, a different interface after doing this particular behavior for years where you are grinding for a written publication and that's the end. It's not that it has to be translated or I have to write the next grant. So I'm always thinking about what's next rather than what am I doing now and how it shifts someone's material circumstances. That 180 isn't going to happen successfully. I'm sure there's folks who do it. Let me take that back. But it's the behavior as simple as how do people adopt deciding to floss every day? That's not easy. So why would we think that engagement of how I'm actually going to treat the whole research process differently will flip once I reach this threshold, and I don't think it's there.
So what I think of immediately when I pose this question is that we essentially have two currencies, and I come from public health training, and if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Spurlock does also. And those are peer-reviewed publications, the number of these high and mighty articles we can write, and we send them out, and folks read them and write us back and said, you offered a definition that is slightly different from the very specific definition I and my folks believe is the correct one, and then we make those changes, and another person says, oh, now you're too far in the other direction. So that's labor intensive, but whatever the case may be, what I figured out probably 12, 13 years ago was that these peer review publications were essentially indecipherable for people who I care about, even my own family members, right? And so one thing that I started to do to gauge the practical value of this currency was to try to share it with my family members who would say to me, thank you very much for sending this thing along. We have no idea what it means. Can you tell us in regular people language? And why don't you get credit for writing in regular people language? Right? And so now you're bumping up against this thing where there's a formal demand associated with this institution. I'm a first-generation college student undergrad, and so there's a great deal of pride associated with my success. And so it's not just individual success, but it's the success of my family, immediate and extended, and a broader community of people, all of whom identify with me. And so to be able to be successful by those formal standards, I gotta do all of these things that no one who really cares about me can ever interpret and understand. The single most frustrating thing that I've encountered in this journey, right? Particularly when the primary motivating interest for me to embark upon it in the first place was to try to do something that mattered for my people. I have not yet figured out how to negotiate that disconnect. I will say, though, that I am now an associate professor with tenure in the Sanford School, which means that I cleared that hurdle. Thank you very much. I think Dean Brownell, I see sitting over there. Thank you, Kelly, for contributing to that. Which means that now, and I will address the point that Danielle made earlier, I am relatively more liberated to do the kind of work that I've always wanted to do without fear of reprisal. I may never make full, but that's okay, because now I can write in ways and say things that I previously could not do in the same way.
For us, for example, there's research that is done in our name. We don't know that it exists. We don't understand it. And who does that information belong to?
Exactly.
It belongs to our community. One of the things that we do is, like, our neighborhood is in the south part of El Paso, right along the Mexican border. And so some people in El Paso say, we don't look south. That means that they don't understand what is going on in our community. So a lot of our work in the activism part is just to bring to light what is happening, right? And so I guess we identify a crisis, or, and then people notice us. But sometimes when they look at us, it's also difficult, right? So how do we make our problems visible, but then that some institutions thrive on that crisis? Mm-hmm. So they ask us questions about what that crisis looks like, who's being affected, because they never bothered to look south to begin with, right? And then they take that crisis and bring resources in the name of that crisis or in the name of our community, but they don't ask how best those resources are to be used. Mm-hmm. Because then that means that they have the right to identify the solution. Mm-hmm. And their idea of progress, as we say, is not our idea of progress. Mm-hmm. They don't ask enough questions to be able to see the world from our perspective, our worldview, what it means, what community means to us. They don't acknowledge the way we identify ourselves. I don't know if that makes sense. So The other part would be they tell us who we are, right? It's always an imposed identity and therefore an imposed solution. And then the research that is done, again, it brings down resources and then it gets put into the pockets of other people that are not our community necessarily. And then when there is research done, we don't have, like I said, we don't have access to it, or we don't always have help translating it. And there's maybe the institution itself, for example, when we talk about NAFTA, or when we talk about how to improve communities, they decide what's worth the investment based on that research. So they make that decision. Who's worth the investment? Where is their money efficiently put into, right? And what's going to give them the better outcome? So that goes along with the solutions. And then when we find people within the institutions that are supported, they don't always have the time to walk with us enough to accompany us in our journey to figure this out. And so they're writing papers on the side in addition to the work that they do.
That's right.
So one of this is the major problem, but it's also just basic stuff. Like, we can't, if we don't have access to the classroom at the universities, we also need to be able to analyze further why our community is the way it is. What's the history of our community? It's not written down. How do we, whatever questions that we have, it always doesn't have to be a lot of intense research on a particular topic, but what is it that you're sharing with your students, and how could it be shared with our community as well, right? Because we also have limited time, because we're always in survival mode and the creating mode. So I can't read 1 million books and then translate them into the language of our community and things like that. And also, the research is for the crisis, but we have a right to create an alternative to that. We have a right to we can't always be put in this crisis mode. We have a right to, as women or as workers, to be able to create that alternative. And that's where sometimes it gets confusing, because you want people to help you with that. But then again, if you're proposing this alternative for people to see you, sometimes means that it comes under attack, because they don't want us to actually put into practice what this alternative is. So it's also sometimes we want them to see us, but then when we see us, it's scary. So that relationship with these institutions is scary, because you don't know when the eyes look in your direction what's going to happen, how much control we have over that, right? And they always attack our solutions. You shouldn't be the people implementing that. You shouldn't do this, right? If they're even able to see. So when they talk about risk in investing, it's not only because we don't know how to manage money, as they tell us, but it's risk in investing for the alternative that we're proposing. And that's where it gets difficult, and it gets scary. Do we want the eyes of these people on us or this institution on us? So anyways, I don't know if that goes with that question.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That part, the risk on investment, is real. It is shocking when we think about East Durham, how much money has been poured into East Durham over the years. Millions, probably billions of dollars, honestly. Organization after organization after organization, right? With our community members, Black and brown people, running from program to program, food program, housing program, backpack program, this program, that program. Meanwhile, our lives are still shitty, right? But when we come up with the solutions, as you said, right, they tell us to be linear thinkers. They say, well, focus on food, focus on housing, right? Don't focus on these other, focus on trees, tree canopies, right? And after school programs. Don't focus on your life as a full, whole person that has to engage with these different systems, right? That's for white folks. They can be systems thinkers. But we gotta be linear in order to solve our problems, because otherwise it's a bad investment. Meanwhile, you spent millions, billions of dollars trying to do something that doesn't work.
It's not meant to work.
And it's not meant to work. And it's purposely not working, because then you can line your pockets and get more money and do more research and do more experiments on us, while we're running back and forth just trying to take care of our daily basic needs. And then when we have the nerve to say something about it, we're ungrateful.
We're definitely ungrateful.
How dare you? Because they don't see us in the first place. They don't believe that we're meant to determine our own lives. They don't believe that we're meant to understand and be subject matter experts on our own lives. Can you imagine, Danielle? You know how to feed yourself? You know how to house and clothe yourself? So when we say we actually have an idea to house and clothe ourselves and all these sorts of things, it's a bad investment. It's too risky. Focus on this thing over here. And I know that folks have good intentions. But this idea that we've been hit with in CIP of trusting the wisdom of the community to, solve their problems and things like that, right? That's like the very benign version. My question is, who gets to convey trust? Who gets to bestow trust? And this idea of, what are you talking about in terms of like the wisdom of the community, as if we're some magical elves and Negroes and brown people walking around here? Like, we know our lives. And if you don't actually think, you don't see me as a person, then you have to bestow trust on me as if I'm some, I don't know, whatever being, to determine what I need. And so when we talk about these systems that dehumanize us, they dehumanize our very ability to be able to be free thinkers, to be able to control our own lives, to be able to create, as you said, and not always react to these systems that have us running back and forth just to have a place to live, sleep, eat. And then they dehumanize Black and brown folks who are in these universities, who came to these universities to get the knowledge to help their people, and they hold them back from even doing that. All of the policies and systems that are put in place purposely so you all can write papers that we don't understand, so you can be separated from your community and for you to be penalized when you have the nerve to actually spend some of your intellectual power on supporting the programs and solutions and ideas for your community. So there's no humanity in that at all.
Thank you. And both Lorena and Aaliyah touched on the next point I'd like to introduce, which is expertise. So what is currently valued regarding expertise in research relationships? And I'll frame this a bit, and we'll talk about three distinct types of expertise. The first we will refer to as academic or investigative expertise, research. The second is educational or teaching expertise, what those of us who do research propose to do in the classroom and relate to the next generation of young folks interested in these issues. And then finally, experiential expertise. What can we learn, or what is the relative value of understanding the importance of learning from folks whose lives are central or proximal to the phenomenon of interest? All right? So in the current set of arrangements, university, community, research, partnership, which of these are valued? Research, teaching, or folks who are out in the day-to-day grind dealing with this stuff? And yes, I have my biases. I'm not objective.
I mean, I think you've laid it out in the hierarchy that it's in. We want the research. We want to be in R1. We want to bring in this money. We want to talk about education and teaching some, but we also want to do a lot of that education and teaching on the backs of communities. So come to my class, do this. We gave you a little piece of money, and now I'm going to email you every week about something. Where I'm like, that is too many meetings. That is me just having a small look into Cameron and Aaliyah's schedule. I'm like, no, they are not compensating you at that level. And then we get to the experience of the practitioners on a day-to-day basis. It's, if you've been in it long enough, maybe we will let you ascend and be a professor of practice. However, that's usually someone who's been part of the status quo for 20 plus years. So you're going to then reproduce those same relationships by elevating someone in practice who has the credentials that you recognize, that is then going to reinforce the hierarchy that you already want to see in research. Because everyone does research. You all ask questions, you gather data. It's not like this, a black box of, yes, a spatial regression might be, but for the most part, folks could tell me there's not enough trees. They're talking about me because I have there's not enough trees in my neighborhood. Yes, folks can see that. And they can also question research that will tie trees with gun violence. Because they'll ask, what is the mechanism there? They don't need to have gone through a research methods class to already start questioning, does that really hold water? And yet, research will say, well, that finding was supported by this this well-determined research design. But all the folks who've been working tirelessly that tie deprivation to gun violence are like, why are you trying to undermine all this work and give me a solution that's, one, seems straightforward, but is also 30 years out, because you're gonna plant some trees, they're not gonna mature until then. So what is again, how have we mobilized research to marginalize again?
Anyone else?
I forget the question sometimes, but
Expertise.
yeah. So in our community, we say that we have the knowledge necessary to create the community that we deserve and that our future generations deserve. And so but we also need more information than that, right? So we're not romanticizing that that we don't have a lot as well, but we know we have knowledge. When there's research and information out there, can it just be given to give? I don't know if that makes sense. Is there strings attached to that information? Because we have the right to listen, process that information in our community, and then we decide how it gets implemented. And that's where there's a big no, you can't do that. So we also think that it's important that if there's information out there in the universities or in other places that we can just use it as we see fit. And how does that look like? Because no one else can tell us how that information can be implemented in our community but us. So again, do we have a right to implement our vision? The answer is usually no, right? So I think that's an important part of that we're not saying we don't need technical or other information, but we want the right to be able to interpret it and put it into practice the way that we see. I think also when we were organizing against the North American Free Trade Agreement, it seemed as an agreement, right? And everybody moves beyond NAFTA. We see it, because of our experience, as another wave of colonization, right? Where it steals and exploits land and people. It pushes communities out. So it's not something new. It's not something that we get over. Every time they renegotiate NAFTA, or at that time, they bring us all this numbers and research, especially our university, because it's right on the border, they try to convince us that NAFTA or other trade agreements are good. And we might not have all the research, but we know what we've experienced. We know that in the 80s, 90s, all our jobs were leaving. We know we weren't able to survive, right? So, and that is not always seen as a strong enough voice, because we don't have that power to negotiate, and we don't have all these numbers about it, and we don't have the resources to make up an argument and then have the time to put the numbers together to defend that argument. It's a lived experience, so we don't have all that behind us. I don't know if I'm making that clear. So that's always really important. Our ability and our right to use whatever is being researched to create a community that is better, and then also is our argument based on our lived experience, our everyday lives. Is that worth anything to be able to fight against these decisions, right?
I think for me, it all comes down to control, right? And we've talked about that, and many of us know that. And I'm very clear, you're not going to control me. You're not going to control my family. You're not going to control the people I care about. And so what I am looking for universities to do, these think tanks to do, is to reorient themselves on their role. Everything that Lorena said, subject matter expert. You, university, technical support assistants. You literally have no idea. You have no analysis of how these systems work. You're not qualified to come up with the question. You are not qualified to come up with the research agenda. And that's the bottom line. What you can do is to provide your support for my regression analysis, which I also understand, by the way. That's what you can do. And what you can do is then take that learning and utilize that in your classrooms and help these students understand what their role is. You can use that when you have all these social impact investors and everybody else making this money to help them understand. You can come up with a technical solution if you want to be a part of this free market, but you're not going to come up here with this other program that's going to make millions and billions of dollars and be inefficient and force people to continue to run back and forth. And as Lorena said, it's just more of the same thing. When I think about how painful, how dehumanizing research is, as a Black person, it makes me think of us not owning our own body. Henrietta Lacks, like we don't even own our own DNA. You have extracted everything from me. And you have put more systems in place purposefully. And you try to control my life. That's what this level is, and that's what we're talking about. And we have to be able to reclaim our place as subject matter experts to develop our own solutions in anything we want, and to create our own world. And you get to be over here with your technical assistants and your big degrees supporting it, or create your own thing.
Yeah. Danielle, do you wish to speak? If not,
it is. Clearly, that's why we work together. The power in the research process should lie with those who actually want to see the problem go away. So much of it is, it doesn't matter. I'm too divorced from where it actually happens. Or my next grant is predicated on that problem still being there. Because I still am going to write up that problem statement of what I'm trying to solve. So the power then should be on the person who's like, I want to work myself out of this job. I don't want to live like this. That's where the power should be versus the person who can often opt out, who can not absorb it day to day to day. If that's not the way we're going to restructure the system, it's really just, again, how do we continue to shift the game so people can continue to exploit and brutalize?
Yeah, so I'd like to pitch in on this one. In recent years, I've become particularly interested in how the university is interested in exploring, researching how minoritized, dehumanized populations contend with imposed oppression and discrimination. I'm increasingly curious about how universities, as research institutions, are themselves reliably producing and reproducing the supremacist system in which that oppression and discrimination are so reliably constructed and imposed. So if we're going to be experts on something, let's turn that critical lens inward and figure out what it is about us that allows us to so reliably, consistently, repeatedly, again, produce and feed into that supremacist relationship, right? And I had a research assistant last summer who actually did some counts to see what proportion of research into racialized health differences proposed to address that positive bias, that supremacy, and the privilege conferred versus the negative bias, oppression and discrimination. And it's something like 98% of those are in the negative direction and only 2% supposed to get at the root cause, which is the supremacist system. That's telling. And I don't believe that that's accidental nor incidental. Right? All right. Next questions. So in public health, we have this framework, community-based participatory research. And one of the things when I was taught this framework 20-something years ago, I proposed to do it early on, is move beyond extractive outcome-based relationships to more relationship-based relationships. And Danielle, if you feel comfortable, if you could start us off by speaking to the degree to which you believe the contemporary model 20-something years later actually has moved us along that continuum away from extractive to more meaningful relationship building.
If we define it as a continuum, it is movement. It is different from the parachuting in, doing some surveys, and then you never, ever, ever see that researcher again. Is it enough? No, because it still is going to center, again, the university in so much of the logistics or the accolades that are attached to it. So in some cases, it's how we fund it. Our entry point with, and that's me working with Kofi Boone, Deb Gallagher, and Kay Jowers with CIP, was that we had a loose idea, but mostly we had money. And it was like, so can we just talk? And we talked a lot about how we were going to go forward. But so many of these research partnerships begin with me saying, don't you want to work for free for a while and help me come up with this process? And so this is to the funders. There's not the funding to create the relationship, so somebody's working for free. I might be working at a lower rate, but I'm probably still well compensated compared to the community partners I'm reaching out to. So if I don't bring anything to the table, I'm still starting off in an exploitive manner where I'm asking you to volunteer your time. And it's often saying, well, you're doing it for your community. Yes, you're doing it for your community, but you're a subject matter expert. And we pay subject matter experts. Right. So so I think that's sometimes how we start off on the wrong foot. It's how we house the money. It's the difference between overhead rates, between if that money, even if we're subcontracting to a community partner, that overhead rate is much lower. Do we think their overhead is that much lower? Do we think they don't need general operating? It's often, and Cameron and I have done some programs together where it's about CDPR. Let's go do a leadership training or whatever. And they're so busy trying to make her into me. It's like, we have 2 hours. Let's cover research design. We're going to do some statistical models, all because what it should be is that relationship where we're doing some translation. I'm making sure you understand, rather than, would you like to do, doctoral studies this afternoon? That means that you're still putting power, that if you become me, you could be an equal partner in this relationship. That's not equal if it's coming this way. What is it? Where's the translation the other direction? So some of the work with CIP is, how do you think about community-rooted participatory research so that it does go farther? Not saying that CDPR didn't pull us, but there's still a ways to go.
Yeah, and so sounds like we move from extractive to perhaps transactional, and still are aspiring to relationship. And so, yes.
So I'm learning about this through Dr. Danielle, and I think we would say that, this is the best example that we have at CIP, because that's our cousin, our sister, everything, in terms of how we engage with universities in this sort of practice. We're also interested in moving away from the transactional, beyond even the relationship, to what does liberated research look like? And for us, that really means, how do we as community members, as Black and Brown people, activate into our own research capabilities? What are our mechanisms? What does that look like? How do we design this in such a way that we're creating our own research think tanks? Whenever Cameron and I would go out and talk about some things, people come up afterwards and want to high five you and everything, and they would be like, oh, is there an article I can read about this? Or is this an SSIR? Or is there something, you know what I mean? I'm like, no. I am telling you, you just heard her come up here and speak, and then you want to go validate what she said in an HBR article? Are you kidding me? So that just meant you didn't get anything, right? So forget that. We can be our own researchers. We can create our own power. And that's what we're trying to do in CIP through Innovation for Liberation. It is our ability to create our own power by saying we have our own IP. We are already developing our own solutions, and we're going to put it in a structure and process, right, that is not white-centered, not based in white supremacy, where people in our community are the researchers. How are we creating our own research agenda? How are we trying out different things in food, in wealth building strategies, in education, and trying to measure impact as defined by our own problem statements? We are geniuses. And we already know how to do this. And when we put our structures in place, and we're writing our own papers, and then we're broadcasting it to Lorena's community and other communities and saying, look what we figured out as Black and brown people. We already know how to do this. What are y'all doing over there in El Paso? Tell us, call and response. What are we doing? That's how we get to liberation. And it's not gonna require us to come and beg some university to give us a paper that we can't even read or interpret. That's what we are looking for when it comes to research and data. And anyone who wants to help us figure out your position and where you stand and how you're going to reorient yourself to that sort of liberated research. Because these old things, you're not going to control us. We're not doing that anymore. We already know we can go beyond that.
I think it's also a question about who can define these relationships, right? So our communities have struggled for so much and have worked so much for many of us and for many of our generations to even be able to attend the universities. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when our people are in there, there's also this push about who is her community, mm-hmm. right? And who is she serving, or who is she working for? Who is she resisting for? Yes. And so that's also another negotiation with the university, right? It's not, when we meet with some of our people that are in the universities, we don't say, oh, she's part of this university. We want to bring her into our community because this is where she belongs, right? And this is where most of her effort should be in service of community. Right. Because sometimes, when we're struggling to survive, we say, if she just goes to the university, then she's going to be okay, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. But freedom means that person is allowed to live and work in community. Mm-hmm. And that that the creativity that she has space for is in benefit of community. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the other negotiation, I guess, or the relationship that we're trying to change, or trying to rephrase or whatever. It's not just it is us battling the university, but it's for the right for some of our people that are in the universities to be able to work in community, mm-hmm. and to serve the community that sent them there, right? And all of their work and their creativity, that they also have the ability not just to be in survival mode in that structure, because it's hard negotiating in the outside world, right? How do we bring them into community so that they have that space for creativity that serves us? That serves community, which they're a part of. So I think that's another one of the hidden battles that there is, right? So I don't know.
Thank you so very much for sharing. A couple of other questions in the remaining 10 minutes or so. And this next one is heavy. So on the university side, we have institutional review boards, IRB, that are constructed and designed to make sure that we're engaging in ethical research from our side. And I wonder, for folks who are on the other side, who sit in communities, what might an IRB, or what set of standards, ideas might you bring to bear to negotiate ethical research on that other side? What sets of standards might you aspire to hold these universities to operate ethically in these other spaces, in the community space?
I'm not sure what that world looks like.
You don't want to know.
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure about all those dynamics. But again, if it's our community that's in those universities, does the research that they do allow for walking with us in our path, for them to be part of community while they're doing that? And is that used, or is that it be able to be evaluated so that their research is, whatever the word is, right, valid, or whatever that research is? How much can they walk with us and to be able to learn what needs to be researched in the first place? Because sometimes they're forced to be from the outside looking in, and we would want them to be able to walk with us. And is that something that is acknowledged so that those things can be identified? I'm not sure if that was clear, but.
That's excellent. Thank you. Anyone else, Danielle?
Yeah, I think IRB does what people expect those extreme cases of racism to look like. It's let me guard against, the Tuskegee experiment. It's doing that versus the day-to-day macro and microaggressions that the research process does. It doesn't catch those because that's not what it's looking for. It's looking for those extreme examples of unethical behavior versus it's unethical for me to reinforce uneven power dynamics, to co-opt others in intellect and experience. Where does IRB capture that? It doesn't. It doesn't ask those questions. So that's where I would say there needs to be this innovation where it's not just looking for the extremes, it's actually looking at that modern, everyday manifestation of immoral activity.
Aaliyah, any thoughts?
No, I think they said it.
Okay. And so, finally, are there incentives from either side, like real actionable incentives, that we can bring to bear to sponsor the kind of responsible relationship, humanizing relationship that we've discussed here today? Any ideas, any thoughts that we can take back to both governmental and philanthropic funders?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about quite a bit is like, what does decolonized research look like? What does that mean? And really being able to operationalize it in different systems and settings. And so this idea of how do you fund that sort of approach, right? Where it is a liberatory approach in thinking about that. How do you get the right groups and sets of people to be able to think about research, as folks have continued to say, through a systems lens? I think that's something to be invested in. And where, again, as I said, are people actually doing this? There's lots of folks who are doing this, right? It's just not being elevated to power brokers. So being able to identify that, and know that might be something that we do, right? Like we as Black and brown folks are actually identifying where this works and where we actually feel like there's collaboration that supports the efforts and ideas and solutions that we are coming up with.
Thank you. Danielle, any thoughts?
Setting aside all the logistics of where we could make those kind of material changes, I think it has to be a change in mindset. And that mindset means that many of these institutions of higher education are filled with people who identify as progressive. And yet you uphold a white supremacist system in your actions, your direct actions and the institution's actions every day. You have to sit with that and figure out how you're gonna be different. Because otherwise, I'm doing the right thing. That keeps you in the same system. It's why I think as a white supremacist institution, institutions of higher education are gonna be hard to dismantle because it is full of well-meaning folks that don't have to examine that well-meaning aspect. So how are we all doing the work every day to question and shift and do the hard family conversations, the hard internal work, is what needs to be done before you go out and look for a community partner, because then you're just going to revisit that harm.
Great.
Can I add to that? I know it's 30 seconds, but I mean, one of the things that I think is really great about the work that Jen is doing with the World Food Policy, Dr. Danielle, Dr. Kay Jowers, and others, is the work of institutional organizing. Y'all work together and organize together around a way in which you can do things differently. You all come together and have those conversations. That's not the work of us. We try to do other things over here, feed people, thrive, all of that stuff. But I do think that where there are pockets in the university that can sort of come out of their own spaces, and I know that's challenging. You know, we talked about working, you know, at Fuqua and things like that, where people can come out of their own departments and actually be doing that white institutional organizing. I think that there's some power and benefit there in terms of them reorienting themselves in their stance.
Great. And so it sounds like relationship between and across groups, relationship within group, but perhaps most importantly, critical self-examination, introspection, relationship within selves, right? And each and every one of us can take a long, hard look of who we are, group identity, individual identity, but particularly as actors within the university as a supremacist system, and take seriously the business of imagining something else and what we can do, whether or not we can leverage any privileges we might have in that space to create opportunities for folks not like ourselves, right? And on that note, I think we're at the end of our time. Will you please join me in thanking the profound expertise chair?